going on? What is going on? We are back again. Like we didn't have like a 45-minute discussion before we got on here. How you doing, brother?
Hey man, doing good. Good to see you. Good to see you. You looking sharp as ever. I saw
Oh
you in the
man,
backstage flexing those biceps. Proud of you. Love it. Love it.
I appreciate it. I'm working on it. I'm working on it, brother. I appreciate it. I'm Mike Seville. On the other side of the camera, we got my brother from another mother, Mr. Joel Simmons of the Tenacity Foundation. Interesting conversations before the meeting. There's interesting conversations after the meeting. I want to talk. We can talk quickly about your group, brother, the gathering. So if you want to continue this conversation, if there's other things that you want to add to, or possibly just come up with out of that, you think people may want to know about, or you want to have conversations about and communicate with people who are respecting uh, and etc. The gathering, brother, talk to them about it.
Yes, absolutely. Appreciate that intro. Definitely thank you for that. The Gathering is a male perspective group. It's a place where each and every last individual male is able to come, be a part of it, and be able to express themselves, be able to find information about the things that are going on in a man's life from a man's point of view. It's a place where there's no judgment. It's a place where the resources are only limited to the individuals that are present. We have all types of backgrounds and fields of study there. We have entrepreneurs, real estate agents, we have counselors, we have coaches, with preachers and pastors, firefighters. We have marketing people. We have people from all areas and walks of life that are there, and they are expressing things that men are dealing with. And it's beautiful. So please check us out. Check the link. It should be down in the description. And we hope to see you there.
And let me make the distinction between judging and observations, because observations are being made. They're not necessarily judging is when we start to put a right or a wrong on something. So and I think people kind of get that confused of, whether it's a judgment, whether it's an observation, because the two things they're eerily similar. However, there's a distinction of it. So there's no this the right or wrong is not there. There's a time. I think what's so dope about the gathering, like you mentioned, is that the observations are made, and then we can kind of dive into these different subjects as opposed to it just being caught up in your mind and your head, and not being, and just holding it within. And it may be whatever it is that you're thinking about. Not maybe. Oft times it does bring a different perspective, because now I could look at it and say, well, hey, I never thought of it that way. Or I can say, hey, bro, let me add some my perspective to it, and then we can all either agree to disagree or possibly align. Either way, it's dope. I think last week we came up with oh man, what was it? Our ability when we get together, how growth happens, right? We were talking about the brotherhood. That's what we spoke about. We were talking about the brotherhood was the topic last week and on the Friday, because you have the Zoom. It's a WhatsApp and there's a Zoom that meet on occasion weekly, is how it has been. And it was so interesting that we all got together, kind of didn't know where the conversation was going, but from that came growth. So
Mm.
it's awesome that when we all get together and we all have these conversations and we make observations, we leave it with growth. So if being growth minded and being successful are a part of your values, and you may feel a little bit stagnant, awesome place to come and join and add on to the conversation, and definitely not just add on, but take away some stuff. So the gathering,
I love it. Yeah.
men,
Good.
join.
Yeah.
Uh, Last week we got into a conversation in regards to identity, becoming a man, we kind of went over some criteria, and was that like a sounded like a sound effect? We kind of went over the criteria of becoming the man. And so there were a couple things that was interesting because I got a call afterwards that week, and someone else was talking about the criteria of becoming not. And we say man, but maybe it's more so like just a man that's certain and stable in their identity. You're right. Like that's the kind of man that we're referring to. Because I would admit last week you kind of said you either you are or you aren't, but there's probably more so of a spectrum, right? There's
Mm.
men who are all the way to the left of the spectrum, and then there's men that are all the way to the right of the spectrum. And let's say all the way to the left on that spectrum, you got people who are kind of timid. They're not, they're weak minded, they're scarcity minded, they're not creating, they're not living in their purpose, so on and so forth. And then all the way on the other end of the spectrum is like Superman. Superman, literally, right? Like that person who's certain and stable about their character. Not to say that mistakes aren't made all along the spectrum, or not when I say mistakes, but things happen along the spectrum. Challenges are happening along the spectrum, but we still when you tend to be certain and stable within it. One of the things that I notice is that when you're certain and stable in your identity, you don't have as much hesitancy. And the hesitancy, a person who hesitates can go anywhere from kind of second guessing what I call your first or your God mind, all the way to 3 days of hesitation slash procrastination, which could be, someone could label as being depressed because you can't move or do anything. And I think the extreme hesitation is like death, like it's the extreme rigidity. There's no movement, and there never will be any movement. So we kind of got into that conversation, and so there was a couple, more than a couple. There was one, two, three, four. I think we added maybe five things that we would add as values of certain and stable. Let's call them strong men. What the first one was compassion. So, what do you think? You want to dive into that?
There was a lot that just went on through my
Did
mind.
it?
There was a lot. There was a lot. But I'm going to stick with what we're talking about right now. As far as compassion goes,
I'm
I
curious now. You started off like that. Now I'm super curious, and I saw you clicking the buttons, which
oh you,
probably
can you
you
see me?
you were like referencing something. So I was like, oh yeah, the brothers jumped into the studying, which is something that we spoke about earlier before we got on here. I'm wherever you want to take it. I'm game, but we'll definitely get.
you know, okay. So the whole thing when we just started off on defining what a man is,
Okay.
that thing right there, I was like, oh man, the definition of a man, what on earth? And so I decided, I was like, let me look up the definition of a man. And there was so much there. And there was nothing that I actually saw that said specifically what a man was. So I started looking it up again. When this time I just punched it into the website just to see what I would get. And talks about being a male, but it was a lot of attribute style words. I'm very curious to go pull one of my deep thinking dictionaries from upstairs to really look it up to understand how do you define a man? What is the definition? Because when we start talking about the attributes of a man, we're talking about attributes, and attributes therefore can be attributed to whom? Whoever.
Yeah.
Anybody can have
Anything.
attributes.
Yeah. Not specific. Yeah.
It's non-specific. And in a
Non-bi
world,
non-binary is the word they use. But go
I
right.
like that. I'm glad you said that because in a world where identity is no longer, you're no longer born with identity, but you choose identity. In a world where identity now is chosen, what is the definition behind what is given? I think that that's huge because I feel as if, especially after the conversation that we were having, which this is absolutely going to be controversial. So, don't hate us inside of
Good.
in the comments. It's 100% controversial what I'm about to talk about, or what I'm going to open the door up to, and that is, we were looking up a poll, and I pulled a Gallup poll, and the Gallup poll started to talk about who identifies as being gay, bisexual, lesbian, LGBT, and the ratio of individuals that were from, I think it was 18 to like 29, youth that subscribed to this poll in the United States was near 30%. Near 30% of young people were identifying as something other than whatever they were born as. And it was interesting to me because, number one, according to this Gallup poll, if you go back, I think it was 20 years or so, the rise in people being gay was at like 26%. Gay and lesbian back then, or gay, lesbian, and bi. Back then, there wasn't a whole lot of letters, I suppose, or at least a lot of letters had not brought themselves to the forefront. There was a thing called being in the closet and coming out of the closet back in the 90s. So in that time, there was like you're either heterosexual or you're bisexual. There wasn't a whole lot. And those numbers they were at like 26% of the population, and it moved from 26 down to 21, and then or 23, and then it moved back up. It went down to 21, then it went back up to 23%. And so there was a dip and then a rise. And then when I looked at the rise, I saw that the majority of the rise was coming out of young people just coming out of high school, which does not mean that those high schoolers didn't have these thoughts or these feelings. I think that it just simply means that you had to be an adult to be inside of this poll. So they started off with 18 because, quote unquote, that's when you become adult in our American society. So when I started to think about that, it's like, what is this identity? That's when we went down the rabbit hole of what I'm going to use it coming from me, so you don't hate on anybody else except for me. But the problem in foreshadowing can be good or it can be bad, or I really think foreshadowing is neutral, quite frankly. I think the result will probably dictate which one an individual prefers to name it as. If you foreshadow something, if you foreshadow your family's going to be wealthy and it happens, it's good. If you foreshadow that your family's going to be poor and indigent, it's bad. So it all depends on the individual, the circumstances, and the results. So foreshadowing is, quite frankly, I suppose, neutral. It's somebody's way of telling a story. Getting back to the title man and the definition of man and how it is extremely ambiguous is this. If our foreshadowing, and let me give examples: radio, music, TV, articles, any type of scripting that is coming from an external point to an internal point. What I mean by external to internal, I mean from a person or an object or something that has the ability to admit some type of knowledge in any shape, wave, or form, from an external point to an internal point, through my ears, through my eyes, through my senses that I can absorb inside of me. Foreshadowing, if there is that point where something happens and we are forcing that, we're moving that in a specific direction based off of how we feel or think or see, then it has the opportunity of causing society to actually become exactly what we desire. We shape the world as we see it. So when we think about what is a man, and there's no rudimentary thought process on what a man, I was thinking I would go in to the dictionary and it will be very simple. A male is somebody housing this type of organ, this type of, it will be very specific. And instead, I got like 7 or 8 different. It was frustrating, brother. I'm looking at it, I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Individual human, a man belonging to a particular category as by birth, residency, membership, or occupation, a husband, a lover, the human race, humankind, a bipedal primate mammal that is atomically related to the great apes, one possessing a high degree, the qualities considering distinctive manhood, such as courage, strength, vigor, quality state of being manly, fellow, chap, individual, person, an individual who can fulfill. I can go on and on. I mean, this thing just keeps on going, but none of it says anything that directly separates a male from a female or a man from a woman. None of it explicitly, distinctively denotes this is this, that is that. Nothing says this is purple, this is yellow. Nothing says this is high, this is low. Nothing says this is in, this is out. None of that really says that. All of it is extremely ambiguous. And so, therefore, it's like, how do you teach somebody what a man is without using descriptive words of what a man should be based off of what an individual feels, which then is scripting, narration, and it is also foreshadowing of something that you intend to have arrive. I told you it just came and you were talking. Yeah.
Confusion, right? Like that, and it's terrible for us as a culture, especially a culture that's attempting to or wants to get to a certain kind of place, who wants to be quote unquote successful, whatever a person would define that as. Um, it's terrible. It's great for content though, because that's why we are here. We're here to actually come back and say this is how we define it, and it prevents this hesitancy and this confusion. Remember, I go back to talk, it goes back to this hesitancy. If I have to go through all of that in order just to figure out what this used to be, either you were or you weren't thing is, ones and zeros, righteous and unrighteous, this is what it is, and it's easy for me to define it and have a certain and stable identity of being a man about myself. So when anything else comes out in the world, because we're going to come up against different cultures that don't necessarily agree or align with what we're saying, and that's fine, and we can do that in um a civil manner. We can have a conversation around it, and we can say to each other, hey, I agree to disagree. We don't align here, therefore, you can go your way, I can go my way, and that's that. However, what's happening is because of this confusion, or really it's the inability for one to define it. So I guess, how do we look at this? And I'm always going to take the positive intention of it. It does allow for this freedom. That's what we're here for. That's what we love America about, is that we have this freedom. However, when you don't take the time out to figure these things out, you can be left in a state of confusion. And once again, this confusion leads to hesitancy. Sometimes it leaves you to question, who you are as yourself and never really be able to fully define that. And then, now we have these huge issues surrounding self-worth, self-value, so on and so forth. So here we are. This is for us to give our take on it. And you don't necessarily, and the person doesn't necessarily have to align with it. So whether or not a person is in the comment section, that says more about them than it says about us having this conversation that we're having now. But what I think the bare bones is, especially with what we're doing, is we're creating a framework. Now they may not necessarily fit in your framework, brother, or necessarily fit in my framework. That's fine. However, they can take this and say, I'm going to create a framework, and you can kind of have something to stand on. Like, I'm standing on this. This is my ideology. I'm open to new information. Yeah, I'm open to new information. If this information may or may not change the ideology, however, I do have something to stand on. And as we spoke about before, we're not just falling through. We're not in quicksand and just steadily going down and being offered information and just questioning everything because we're confused. And once again, I'm telling you, this hesitancy theory model that I'm having of where where are we hesitating at, and why are we hesitating, and how long is the hesitation? This is part of and I think we're going to go into that, some self-awareness, etc. Like, what makes us hesitate to bring our information up front, or to say something. So that's my thought on it. It's
Mm.
crazy that just in us, something as simple as defining it could lead, if we weren't able to have these discussions, to more confusion. Well, because now you just looked it up in the dictionary, or whatever source it was you looked it up at, and you could be more confused going in there than you were prior to even getting there. So we get a chance to really sit back and peel the layers back and say, well, this is what it is. This is what we're basing it on. This is the ideology. And I really do encourage people who are watching this to engage and say, well, hey, brothers, you all left this part out. You all left this part out. Or, ultimately, brothers, I agree with you. Or I'm aligned with you. This makes total sense. And now I can kind of start moving in a direction that aligns with myself, altogether. So
Mm. You know what? I like that. You taking a pause? May I state something?
yeah, no, I'm
I
of
like
course.
that. So as you're saying what you're saying, you brought to my attention. I said, that's the dictionary. You started talking about the definition and where that definition brought this conversation. And you started talking about the quicksands, which maybe we can mention what the quicksands are for people out there shortly hereafter. But if the conversation moves in that direction, the solid foundation, this is my solid foundation. I think Mike would agree as it's being his as well. This is my solid foundation. This is where I stand from. This is where I come from. So now that I look at the dictionary and it's very ambiguous, I need to check something else. I need to check my source, my reference, my rock for greater understanding. Because whenever I do that, a lot of times associated with my dictionary, I find a greater amount of understanding. And as Solomon stated one time, wisdom is the principal thing, but with all that getting, get understanding. So, with that being said, brother, listen to this. Genesis chapter 1. We talk about this scripture all the time because there's so much that is simply written in Genesis chapter 1 that it's almost bizarre how much information you can get about who you are just by rereading Genesis chapter 1. So, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. And God said, let us make, listen, man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creepy thing that creepeth upon the earth. That's interesting. Listen to this next verse. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. So when you take that scripture and you start to find that frequency where you are arriving at some sort of understanding with that, there's three personalities that are named next to God. There's God standing alone. And I know that there's a lot to talk about God inside of those scriptures, but I'm not going to open that door currently. Then God makes mention that we will make man. Then God makes mention that male and female, we will make them. So I think here's a defining point for me as a man where that stands. Man is symbolic of mankind in this scripture. It is the creation that is created after the image of God. But male and female is the creation of man. I don't want to use the word divided, but in the sense of one being two. There's a lot to be said in this, because remember, when you think about creating man in the image of God, if there's anything that's in the image of God, then it must possess then as an image is a replica or representation of that is. So if God is able to create heaven and earth, well, out of what? So God creates heaven and earth out of what? Out of himself. Isn't that birth? To create something that was not there out of something that was there, that's birth. God birthed heavens, earth, the sea, the fishes in the sea, all of these things he created out of his word. That's a form of birth. It's the same way when we speak words, it's almost as giving birth to a syllabus, to a paragraph, to a song. The melodies that quiet the heart of the sin-sick soul comes from out of the mouth. With the mouth, we have the power to destroy, and we also have the power to build out of the mouth. So it's a creative force that we have. So this is mankind, the image of. So when mankind is made, but then there is a dividing factor, because that means that man would have to be able to three things. Those things were to be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth. So God separated male and female. They go forth to be fruitful, multiply, subdue the earth, have dominion, so on and so on and such forth. So I think that that's interesting, because now when you follow that up with the word male, and you look that up, Merriam-Webster Dictionary, it states of relating to or being the sex that typically has the capacity to produce relatively small, usually motile gametes, which fertilize the eggs of a female. Having or producing only stamens or staminate flowers, having a gender identity that is opposite of female, made up of usually adult members of the male sex consisting of males. A characteristic of boys, men, or the male sex, exhibiting maleness. Oh, now it's like, all right. So when I say a man is a man, in essence, am I really talking about humankind? When I say a male is a male, am I narrowing that down to who I am? I don't want to use the word identify as, because it's born with. You're born with that. You don't just wake up 9 years later, 18 years later, 27 years later, 50 years later, and like, oh, you know what? I'm a flower. No, that's not the definition of being a male. So I want to leave you with that right there, brother. Oh, yeah, we're getting into it today. Cup number 2. Let's go.
I almost want to pause it. Listen, there's a lot to unpack within that statement. And I think on our first episode of this series, we kind of broke down the biology of it, right? And you went a little bit further into it. I think you kind of, it's interesting because you kind of brought the feminine into it as well, especially in regards to the dividing of God as a being, right? That because God at some point gave birth, right? So it would almost signify that these two things were one, and then it got divided at some point. Am I? Are we clear on that?
Very
Did you?
clear. Think
Okay.
about why woman, the old Genesis, I can go back to it just for the people out there to hear it. But when you start to think about where woman came from, I think that that's a heavy discussion. I don't normally like to talk a whole lot about that because,
Why?
well, because there's a lot of controversy behind it. So I don't
Right.
mind speaking about
So
it.
so let's. I think that's why we. This is it's great for content. It's tough on the youth and what they have to do with, because we weren't having these conversations 60 years ago. But when the man is taken out of the home, when the male part of this equation is taken out of the home, we spoke about this last week and before we got on camera. 80% of uh, black people used to be married. Black people used to be married at a rate of 80%. They led everything. So now we're about 60 years in. This is from 1970. Excuse me. I'm getting older. So we're about 70 plus years in of
Still
the
look good.
man. No, I appreciate it. God is shining this light on me. If you can't tell, with 74 years later, where now the mothers, or excuse me, the generation prior didn't have a father there. The generation prior to that didn't have a father there. The generation prior to that, there was a weakening of a male being in the household, even being there. You started off there, but then it was just like, hey, through whatever situations, I'm not going to get into that part of it, but so we're almost in like the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, for some families, seventh generation of no man being in the house, and this is just in the last 60 to 70 years, right? So now we have this single led household, single parent led household, um, to where it's no longer, and even in that vein of it, the man is no longer there's no reverence in it. There's no reverence in being a male. And this is why we start to see a lot of anger towards males and fathers, and a lot of people are going through it, and a lot of people have to go through it, and a lot of people get stuck in it. And so now where do we base, where do we base this? And that's what you kind of spoke about that earlier. Like, where do we base our ideal of what a man is? Well, definitely not from the description that you read earlier, because it just confuses it. So most of us tend to base this definition off of, we didn't have a strong, like grandfather or something like that. We start to base this off of our environment. And I think even more so, more than just our environment, is the programming that you spoke about earlier. These external stories and narratives that are pushed that way. And so sometimes we become hyper or hypo one way, and or sometimes we become less, or excuse me, hyper. Yeah, so we become less of it, hypo. But there's no clear and cut definition unless you start to do the digging. This is what for and a lot of us don't either have the understanding or the resources or the know-how, or really at some point in time, especially now, we don't want to invest in ourselves to even do the to get to understanding what it is.
Mm.
So it's a tough conversation to have. It's, and this is you know why it's so tough is because we're still having the same conversation that we're almost having from our first episode diving into this. This is you and I who have a, but I think this is the compassionate part, because we should kind of because we are now having these conversations with men that are in the group, the gathering,
Mhm.
and I have countless conversations with men and women outside of that I mentor and I help to guide. And there ultimately comes a point where people are stuck on something, and you start to and I start to and now and it's so, to me, because I'm watching it, it's so evident the situations and the details might be somewhat different in everybody. There's certain nuances, right? The exact information, but I can see when this thing is struck, this anger towards what happened in their lives, towards absence, towards abandonment, or seeming abandonment. There and I'm gonna use I like Jesse Lee Peterson. He's so funny to me, but he's gotten to a point where there has to be a return to the father, and there has to be a return to the maleness and a manlyhood. That's why we've named this series "The Rebuilding of a Man." And sometimes we really have to strip it all the way down in order for us to come back up and say, okay, well, a lot of the images and the programming that we have seen weren't necessarily true. And how do we, and not to judge anything. What happened. It was what it was, and it is what it is. Now, how do we change that? And that's through us defining it. I think we use Webster and these different sources as guidelines of how to stay on the path of it. But ultimately, we have to sit here and decide, what does this look like for our culture, and really and see how we can have a positive effect on it. Let's run through some of these values. And people, if you've made it this far, we appreciate it. We're going to run through some quick values on this, and if we're missing something, you can add it, and and we can go from there. We can engage within the comments or DM us, or you can have these conversations in the gathering. We said compassion,
But
right? Like, go ahead,
let
go
me
ahead.
give the scripture though, just to preface where you're about to go.
Go
Because
ahead, go
while
ahead.
you were saying that, I felt like you had asked me in the very beginning. You said, "Why don't you normally talk about this?" And that's because you have to have enough time to actually allow the information to settle into an individual. It's not something that you want to brief
Absolutely.
over.
Yeah.
But what you're about to discuss, especially when you start off with compassion, and I think that this helps a little bit because you asked the question. You said it sounded as if God birthed. And he said, "Is that what you're saying?" And I
Yeah.
was saying, yes. God gave birth to all these things, which would mean that, he had the ability to procreate. I mean, he is God, right? And then man, quote unquote, was created in that image. So this is the thing. This is the tricky part people miss. And I wanted to share this, and I'll keep this piece short so that we can go into attributes. In the book of Genesis, the second chapter, This is what I found. 21st verse. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam. And he slept, and he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man made he woman and brought her unto man. And Adam said, this is now bone of my bone, bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. There's a powerful scripture, and I don't know if anyone has thought about it this way or if it was even taught this way. I don't believe it was. Maybe there's someone out there who's taught it, but I don't believe it. I think this is going to be the first time you ever heard it this way. This is none other than a C-section. It's very similar. It's an epidural and a C-section. And God caused the deep sleep to fall upon Adam. It's like when a woman gets an epidural so that she does not feel the pain of giving birth. And he slept, and he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh inside thereof. He removed something out of Adam to form a new person. It's the same way when a woman goes through a C-section and they pull the baby out, a new person comes out. Then he closed them back up, and he brought the woman to man. The same way you give the baby to the woman, and she lays the baby on her chest because the baby knows the mother, understands the voice, the warmth. There's a connection there between baby and the maternal parent. There's a connection. It's been there for such a long time. So this person was brought back to Adam, and Adam said, this is now bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. She was a part of man. So in the same essence as God birthing all of these things, man birthed woman. And that's why this isn't something I just can glaze over it. Because somebody's gonna go back and say, da. Well, I guess you're gonna have to DM me and you're gonna have to do it. But that's what the scripture says. It states it just like that. And this is what Adam declared. Because she came out of me. She's not man, she's woman. It's because she was separated from inside of me. But she's still man. She's just woman. In other words, she was the first baby born by man. And man was the first one born by God. And God gave the differentiation by calling one male and one female.
Right.
And if we wanted to really get into it, then we would have to locate the reason why the woman was created. But that's not where we're headed with this. So now when we start talking about these attributes, and some people say, oh, no, that's a feminine attribute. That attribute right there, that should just be for women. Well, hold on. If man was the first mother.
I'm kissing the crowd.
If man was the first mother, then why wouldn't he have motherly instincts? Why would he not feel compassion when man was the first mother? All right. I'm going to close it right there, and I'm going to let Mike get on into this next piece.
Okay. Yeah, brother. Quick short break. We're back. And then and that conversation gets into the masculine and the feminine, right? Like and a lot of that stuff is not gender specific. So we'll get into the quick values. Compassion. I just don't see how that could be even be a feminine trait. How things are expressed. Like how do you express compassion as a
Hmm.
value, right? It's a manly thing to show compassion. It's for my there's a saying that goes, and we spoke about this before the show started, which is only the strong can show compassion. That's my thought process on it. What do you think? What are your thoughts on it?
I think compassion is very relevant. I
Yeah.
think it's necessary. And my stance is always from a biblical point of view. The individual who shared compassion, the individual who spoke of compassion or was spoken of as being compassionate the most was Jesus.
Yep.
Scripture's always talking about, and he had compassion. It's a very real thing, and I think that men ought to understand compassion, because there comes a point in time where people don't know. And if the only thing we do is become judges, and I think that you mentioned that whether on the show or before the show, you were mentioning something about the judgment versus
Observing
observance.
and
Yes.
discernment.
Discernment. And discernment was another thing, and that's also an attribute of God. And once again, if it's an attribute of God, if it's an attribute of Jesus, who I believe is God, so if it's an attribute thereof, I believe that as a man I should have it, or as mankind we should have it. As a male, in the being in the familiar walk as of Jesus, then I should have it, because he exhibited compassion. And another concern that came up was just that when it came down to judgment, there came a time when he started to talk about eye for an eye, and people were like crying out. They wanted, XYZ to happen. And he said, yeah, well, that's part of the law. However, you do not execute mercy, and mercy rejoices against judgment. Compassion gives opportunity for mercy, and mercy gives opportunity for redemption, for learning, for growth. That's what happens when we become compassionate. So, does a man need to be compassionate? Well,
Absolutely.
if you want your child to be a rock, a stone, and know nothing of compassion, of love, he to possibly become a dysfunctional, speaking of the male, man to his wife, to his woman, some day and age, and not have compassion to understand when she's at a weaker sense, or when she's going through an emotional crisis or roller coaster, and you just want him to be stiff as a board and like, I don't care, it's going to be my way or the highway, which some women are okay with that. But many a time, especially in over the last 3 decades, maybe 4 decades, we had this shift where men have had to become more compassionate, because women entered into the workforce, and no longer was a man the only one who could bring home the bacon. All of a sudden, the fields of playing were even. There was no high mountains, there was no low valleys. Everybody had the same opportunity. Now, it took time for women to start earning the same amount, and there's still some fluctuations within that, just like there's still fluctuations with minorities, right? But the thing is that a man had to become more compassionate, because you couldn't be like you were back in the 60s. You could not do that nowadays, because a woman like, I'm independent. Go out and get my own job. I'll bring home my own bacon. I'll put bread on the table. I'll pay my own bills. I really don't need you. And all of a sudden, men had to learn how to become a little more compassionate. And I think that was a wake-up call, because if you look at Jesus being 22,000 plus years ago, already being compassionate, saying stuff like, how long must I suffer you? But then being compassionate, and then out of the same words, he would say things like, I call you not my servants, but my friends, because a friend will lay down his life. thing takes it to a whole nother level. And that level is where we as men need to be at. So I'm with it. Compassion.
I love it. Here's my pushback, because I don't care if a woman is in the workforce. Like it is what it is, and if that's what you all come together to, because there's a reason why. Because you could live off of one person's income if that. So if that was the plan, but you all have to come with the plan. I think the compassionate part is already there. The strategy may need to change, and it may have always needed to be changed. One of the things that I think is we would include in it is the growth of it. Like the compassionate is just not, there's just not one way of expressing this thing. And I would also advise the man to first be compassionate with yourself, because if you don't have it, it's going to be
Mhm.
really tough for you to give it. So if you're not compassionate within yourself, then screw who else, whoever you're attempting to give it to, because that's going to come across as being overly something. Because you can also be overly, quote unquote, compassionate, or express it in an overly kind of way, and it's still going to give the same amount of negativity. I gave her everything. I did everything that she asked me to do. I gave it, blah, blah. And this is not me just saying a man is here to dominate a woman. However, if you don't have this value, if you don't have it to give to yourself, then more than likely you don't know how to express it outwardly in a healthy way. Um, but there's growth and resiliency within that compassion. So a man should also be learned. I put resilient. It's kind of the word. I don't know if that, and I probably spelled it wrong too. So forgive me, guys. It wasn't Joel. It was me, of being the resiliency in each of these different values. So a resiliency within the compassion, or a growth within it. That way the compassion is there. The strategies may change. You may start to become less of this in our culture, which is more so we tend to have a more dominating way of communicating, versus a compassionate, or a what's the word? A domination, correction, and I don't know, let's call it understanding. So the compassion is there. Maybe we express it differently. Maybe we don't have it doesn't come from a more dominant place. That's more strategy than it is the actual being of this value, which is compassion. And I agree with you wholeheartedly on the model, which we'll get into at some point in time. The model of Jesus being compassionate within his walk.
Yeah. I'm, I like that. I like that. When, especially the modeling piece. As far as that modeling goes, who we model makes a huge difference in who we are, who we become, and what we feel like we are. We were speaking about the percentages. I'm going to go back to that statement. Now that you brought up that word modeling, we we go back to the pre conversation before this episode, and you had brought up a certain instance where a lady, I believe it was a lady, a person, I suppose you can correct me, a person had mentioned that 80% of the men that see that of some sort, some poll, whatever it was, I don't know. I think that the jury was out.
Her poll. It was her poll. Pause. It
Her
was her
poll,
sampling. Her sampling of her population. Right.
80%
80%.
were
Yeah.
gay, lesbian, whatever it was.
Yeah.
And when we did the research and we pulled up a couple polls that we're unbiased about, one of them being the Gallup poll, I don't remember the other one, but we pulled it up. The numbers were exactly the opposite. I think we mentioned that at the beginning of this episode. So modeling, identity and modeling have a lot to, there's a bridge that goes from identity to modeling and from modeling to identity. I want to say that that bridge would be perception. I believe that that bridge is perception. When you're looking from, say, modeling is on the east and on the west is identity, or vice versa. Identity is on the east and modeling on the west. then your perception changes on what you're looking at. When you're looking for your identity and you're seeking somebody to model, then you have a perception from a who am I point of view. When you begin to model after somebody and you feel as if this is who you are, and you look at your identity, then you start to have a perception of I am what? Or I am that I am. You have these different viewpoints, and I'm sure there's many more than that. So I was looking up this, and Henry David Thoreau said, "It's not what you look at that matters; it's what you see." And I think that it's really important. If you look at the last episode that we had with the thumbnail, it was a young man that was looking in a mirror, and he was like in rags. Inside the mirror, he was dressed up. So it's not what you look at that matters. It's what you see. It's what you perceive. It's what you take in. It's what you digest. How many times have we been in the middle of a conversation and somebody said dot, 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 and the thing that we heard was blah, 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 blah. It's something totally different. The wavelengths, they weren't aligned. What we heard may not have been what was said at all. How many times have we looked and seen something? How many times have you looked and out of your peripheral, you see a shadow go by? You look over there, there's nothing there. It's so that there's something about the perception, is something about what the eye sees that the mind relays. If you look into like AI, the way that they are developing AI, like Google AI, what they do is they take a picture. So they'll take this mug, and then they'll type in mug, coffee mug, or anything else, and then they'll do this, and they'll put in mug, coffee mug, etc., etc. And that's so that the computer knows that this is not a mug, because it doesn't have the definitive attributes that denote what a mug looks like. That's the way our brain works. We're always looking at something and attempting to justify what it is. And then we identify it. So when there's a misidentification, it's because whatever we were modeling looked that way or didn't look that way, or it was skewed. And so that perception is something that helps bridge the gap between identity and modeling. So if you have an identity crisis inside of your life, if a man is unsure, if he's a man, if he's unsure about the compassion, if he's unsure about the resiliency, if he's unsure about the attributes of what he is, it may quote unquote, may have something to do with the way he sees his world at this point in time. It may have a concern with what he is modeling as being a part of his world. And that goes back to foreshadowing. What do you say? Or
Yeah, I
scripting?
mean, I absolutely. How a person sees, how a person perceives themselves to be, is kind of how they experience things, and how they choose to experience
Mm,
things. There's and all of these are based on something. We have something, what we tend to do is we tend to generalize, delete, or distort whatever it
mm,
is that we're experiencing based upon our history, based upon the way that we perceive things that have had happened to us. Um, and so there's also here's something within that. Let me take this passion down because we're not talking about it. Is that there's something called cognitive dissonance, to where we may be able to, and there's a lot, and there's also other, negative things that we go. Narcissists tend to think of from a certain viewpoint, borderline personality disorders. We also have some people who experience hormonal or some type of changes within our bodies that allow us to distort things, or generalize, or specific, generalize, distort, or delete things that we see, which is interesting. That's when we have to come back to it. And this is the knowing of oneself.
mm.
Um Chris Voss spoke in the Chris Voss, who was the writer, excuse me, the author of Never Split the Difference, talks about making us anger makes you dumber, is what he says. So anytime you trigger somebody, regardless of what, you can be giving them something that's very beneficial to them, but if you trigger something within them where they're generalizing, distorting, or deleting this information, they are still going to ultimately see what it is that they want to see. This is
Mm,
why there are certain strategies of communication where you bypass a lot of these different behaviors, because what you want is to have clear communication.
mm,
um and I think we're gonna stop here, and I'm gonna tell you why. Because we're having this conversation, we're recording this, and I think this deserves an even deeper dive, because some things have came up in this conversation that it's like we can't even get to the next level, right? It'd be great if, because we have, you and I have done a lot of studying, we've done a lot of research, we've spoken to a lot, we speak to a lot of different people, and we want to get to a certain kind of place. But which is one of the values of being a man is, and I had it written up here, is that we have to have the patience as we go through this entire series, because there's going to be, because just even at the point of when you were speaking about God and man, and then how woman came from man and man came from God, etc. A lot of people can't even get past that point. A lot of people can't get past the compassion. Well, what do you mean? In regards to, she's making more money than me, but I'm supposed to be the leader, and how do I do that when, because
mm,
your value is based in money, and your value is based on
mm,
certain things that aren't necessarily, I wouldn't consider, it has nothing to do with actually being this man that we're talking about. It's less
mm,
about this, what's on you, I heard someone say,
mm,
than what's in you. And so we have to get to the point and the core of it, because once because people may, based on their situation, who don't have this information, they may devalue you in their minds. Oh, this brother's only making, in their minds, is only making $30,000. Well, just because he only makes $30,000 does not make him less. That's not what makes him less than a man. Just
mm,
because he's doing some type of blue collar job, or a job that's not, sensationalized, that doesn't make him less as a man. He can, these two people can essentially go into the same building, or go into the same area and have conversations as men, with no one looking down on the other one, because regardless of how much money this person makes, that car doesn't make you better, that the house doesn't make you better, your bank account doesn't make you better. There's That's not it. So we really, I think, we take a really deep dive into what makes it, you know what I mean? And it has nothing to do with, these so-called earthly things.
mm. I love it. I love it. Yeah, I'm down for that because I definitely want to get into that cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
I, that phrase was floating on my mind when I was speaking just a moment ago. So I'm glad that you picked up that baton and started to run with it. So I'm definitely down for that. I do want to mention this. Stephen Covey, he had mentioned that the way we see the problem is the problem. So if we're having a problem, if we're having a challenge, I mean, we can call it a challenge, but whatever we want to call it, it's our perception is part of the concern. It's how we perceive what we see that has created whatever it is, the challenge that we're faced with. So if we have an identity crisis, it starts with how we perceive it, what we
Mm,
see. Why is
yeah,
it a crisis? If we don't even know that it's a crisis, but we just have all these things that are happening, it has a lot to do with how we perceive these things. And
absolutely.
I know that from myself, how I perceive something. I don't know if those that are actually following what we talk about, it was either the last episode or the episode before that, but I literally was in the middle of my speech or speaking about a situation that happened to me when I was younger. And at that level, I had discovery and I had to reframe everything that
Mm,
I was about to say because I saw it differently, just like that. And the minute I saw it differently, it gave me freedom
Come
from
on.
what I was about to say. And I was unable to say it the way that I had thought about it because my perception had instantly changed. And it was something that I've been dealing with quite some time. So you guys can go back and look up our last maybe 2 episodes and see where I ended up giving a story about myself and my father. And you'll see there was a change there. If you go back and look at our older episodes, you'll hear the old way I thought, and then you'll hear the new way that I thought. And I want you to know it happened in the midst of speaking it out. So if we're looking for, I want to give some tangible things. If you're looking for some changes, some adjustments to your life, this is one avenue, a mastermind. And that's essentially what we have established here. Community Beacon is really a place to mastermind. It's an opportunity, like Napoleon Hill stated, where you can speak with somebody else that has viewpoints that align and also exceed what you may be thinking. They may be more fit in another area of life. So they bring something to the table and they offer it to you willingly, where you can put trust into them, that they've done their research, that they live the type of lifestyle that aligns with the words that they're speaking. And therefore, you can enter into their seat and you can enter into their voice and you can enter into their point of view, and you can gather information from that to formulate a new point of view. That's the essence of a mastermind. Having individuals around you that can speak about the same thing from a different point of view. And once that happens, you can create a brand new point of view. And that's the power of the Community Beacon. It doesn't necessarily tell you what to do. We don't tell you what to do, but we offer you a different point of view so that you can, what Solomon said, wisdom is the principal thing, but with all that get understanding, so that you can come and hear what we have gathered over the course of our life, our studies, our examination, and you can apply that to your reality, and you can take that and form a new ideology of who you are, and you can become satisfied in that and walk therein with all that get understanding. So I pray and I hope that you've gathered and got something out of this. We're about to go into the gathering, so I hope that you all had a wonderful time. This is the Blueprint series, y'all. Make sure you stay on board.
Love it. Love it. Guys, appreciate you. And we will see you next week.